So welcome to the second part of our brain and cranial nerves lecture. If you recall, in the first part, we covered the structure and function of the cerebellum, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the midbrain and the diencephalon. Now, for here, we're going to pick up with the largest portion of our brain, the cerebrum. Now, recall we've talked about the organization of these structures, and we'll look at some general anatomy, but remember we had gray and white matter that was flip-flopped as compared to the spinal cord. Remember, gray and the spinal cord was on the inside, the unmyelinated axons on the inside, and the white matter, the myelinated portion, on the outside. Here, it's going to be opposite. The outermost superficial-most layer will be gray matter, so the cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter, which contains billions of neurons. Now, it's general anatomy. We look at our definitions. Gyri, all the bumps on the brain are going to be called gyri. Then we have these deep slits called fissures. And then shallow grooves that outline the gyri are called sulci. So these are all going to be identified on the cortex. Deep to the cortex is the myelinated portion, the white matter, which is going to be composed of tracts of neurons that connect parts of the brain to each other, as well as the spinal cord. Now, the white tracts that allow for the left hemisphere to interpret and talk within the left hemisphere are called association tracts. Now we look at a series of tracts that connect the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. This is called the corpus callosum or corpus callosum. These are called commissural fibers. So again, if you go to the spinal cord, we talked about the gray commissure and the white commissure, the connection from the left and right portion of the spinal cord. Here it's no different. It's just a lot larger. It looks like a little Nike swoosh when you look at a mid-sagittal cut. Again, to identify it, it's called the corpus callosum, and these are commissural fibers. So let's take a look at the anatomical details of the cerebral cortex. So what can we see? We can see some general anatomy. For example, we have our bumps, our gyrus or gyri for plural. We have our sulcus, shallow grooves, or sulci for plural. And then you can see the gray matter outlined here and the white matter deep. So we'll say gray matter and white matter. Okay, and then we just name the structures. We have the cerebral cortex, which is the gray matter, the cerebral white matter, and then we have this deep slit. Okay, this is our fissure. Now we can be a little more specific and we can look at the brain in its entirety and we could name the lobes of the cerebrum. Now remember, it follows what we did with bones. So that front portion is called the frontal lobe. We have the parietal lobe and our occipital lobe. Now, that deep slit that we just pointed to here has a name. It is called the longitudinal fissure. Now, we do have a sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobes, and it is called the central sulcus. Now, the central sulcus, and I'm just going to highlight it here in blue for you because this is super important. It delineates association parts. Now you say, what association parts are being discussed here? Well, we're talking about these pre-central gyrus and post-central gyrus. Now we're going to jump ahead a little bit and name the function. Now the pre-central gyrus, when we talk about its function, is primary motor. Now when we talk about the post-central gyrus, the post-central gyrus here is going to be primary somatosensory. So now we're talking function. Now we're kind of, again, taking a step forward, but we have to identify these because these are important integration centers. So we talk about primary motor, primary somatosensory. So when we talk about that sensation, you put your hand on that hot stove, that stimuli is going to be integrated right here in this post-central gyrus. And then the motor response is going to be interpreted and sent out those descending tracts via the precentral gyrus. So let's elaborate on the lobes of the cerebrum. So we identified on the last picture a couple of them, but we didn't hit up all of them. And we are going to get into function as well. So again, follow our bones. We have our, number one, our frontal lobe. We have our parietal lobe right here. We have on the side that we didn't see in the last picture is the temporal lobe, followed by, in the back, the occipital lobe, and this really odd projection that's in between the parietal and temporal lobes, this insula. Now, the insula is a pretty important structure. It's really, really tiny, but it serves a very, very, very important function. Now, what it does is it provides an emotional cognition to physiological experience. So what does that exactly does that mean? What that basically means is that if there's pain in any part of our body, it's the job of this portion of our brain, the insula, to tell us that this is an unpleasant feeling. So again, a very important part. So if you think about it, could you imagine where a world where you were not able to understand what was happening to your body? And again, that's because the insula needs to know how to react to when your body is experiencing different types of emotions. Now, what if you damage this section? We are going to go through different parts, but I like the insula because there's a little interesting part of our brain stuck in a really weird spot. So any damage to the insula would mean that you wouldn't be able to differentiate between emotions, and that would be a very, very odd and bizarre feeling. Let's look at this cerebral white matter in a little more detail. So again, we'll get rid of the cerebral cortex. That's the gray matter. What we're really interested in here are all these different tracts and fibers. So let's point out our commissural tracts. So again, what these commissural tracts are doing are connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain, allowing for communication. We have number one, the largest, the corpus callosum, right? And if we were to outline this big Nike swoosh right here, that would be the corpus. And then, like and very similar to the spinal cord, we have our anterior commissure. So again, it is just in front, so it's a little bit inferior to the corpus callosum, but it is in the anterior aspect of the brain. This is the anterior aspect of the brain right here. So we're dealing with the front. And then we go to our association tracts right here. Now remember, the association tracts and fibers are connecting regions within the same hemisphere of the brain. So what this is doing is it's allowing each region to connect to and communicate to other parts of the brain or to the spinal cord. And again, important fact is we're on the same side. And again, same thing with these projection tracts. They are association tracts as well. The next part of the cerebrum we're going to look at are the basal nuclei. Now, the basal nuclei are paired masses of gray matter, and they are located in each cerebral hemisphere. They're going to serve a major responsibility. That responsibility is for body movement and coordination. Now, they work together with a system that we looked at before, the pyramidal tracts. Remember, those were motor pathways. This pathway functions by conducting signals for action, again, movement, to the nerves that connect the cerebral cortex to the motor neurons. And the ultimate aim, what happens here, is it's going to activate skeletal muscle. So again, remember, this is dealing with motor response. Now, the newest part of our brain, which is the limbic system, is also the most interesting. Now, the analogy I use to help people understand our brain is Russian dolls, or other people know them as nesting dolls. And if you think of it, it is a smaller doll that is put in a larger doll, into a larger doll, into a larger doll, into a larger doll. Now, if we think about our brain this way, think about layers on top of layers on top of layers, and we go to the smallest doll in our nesting doll scenario, which is the oldest part of our brain. And the largest doll, the outermost doll, is the newest part of our brain. Now, if you go to the pons and the medulla oblongata, these are our vital reflex centers, right? So this is the oldest part of our brain. This is the part of our brain that developed the first, the longest time ago when you talk about evolutionary development of humans. Now, the interesting thing is if you come to the most recent part of our brain, the part that makes humans really unique and different, is our ability to emote and our ability to learn and establish memories. So the limbic system is really the outermost doll, the most complicated portion, the newest portion of our brain. The limbic system is found within the cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon. It is made up of a couple portions: the amygdala, which is the emotion center, the hippocampus, which plays a major role in formation of new memories based on past experiences. So if we can outline this limbic system and we say, well, what is its main function? It's involved in things like motivation, emotion, learning, and memory. Now, its location again is where the subcortical structures meet the cerebral cortex. Now, when we talk about how it's integrated with other systems, the limbic system operates by influencing the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system. So we're starting to see other mastery systems being tied in to the newest part of our brain, specifically the endocrine system, which is governing, you name any mastery system in the body, and the endocrine system has its hands in it. And then the autonomic nervous system, things like fight or flight and rest and digest. Functional organization of the cerebral cortex. Specific types of sensory, motor, and integrative signals are processed in certain regions of the cerebral cortex. These are going to include sensory areas, motor areas, and association areas. So again, these association areas are where we are integrating sensory and motor information. Let's look at some of the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So again, we're going to landmark an important structure. There it is, that central sulcus. Let's jump posterior to it. It gives us that primary somatosensory area. So again, we're dealing with sensation coming in here. Behind that, the region is a somatosensory area as well. So we look at the back portion of this parietal lobe. We can also see that we have an integrative area here, a common integrative area. Now we have a couple areas that we're going to look at together. So we're going to change to a highlighter. So I want to highlight these regions for you. The first is Wernicke's area. The other is Broca's area. Now, these two areas are typically found on this side of the brain only, on the right side of the brain. And the interesting part is they work together. And we say, well, how do they work together? Well, Wernicke's area is an interpretive area, whereas Broca's area is for speech. So I think of it like this. If you've ever taken Spanish before or any language, you look at the word boca means mouth. Broca is very similar to that. That's how in my brain it helps me to remember it. So Broca's area is our speech center. This is what is allowing us to form words and talk. And then Wernicke's area and the posterior aspect, and that parietal lobe, is really going to be for understanding, interpretive area, understanding what's being made by Broca's area. We go to the occipital lobe, and we see that it is a primary visual area. So this is our visual association, right? And here we are again, primary visual. And then we have our temporal lobe. Now, what do we have in our temporal lobe? Well, the easy way to think about this is, well, what structures by that? Our ear. So we get primary auditory. And here's our auditory association area as well. Now we can come to our frontal lobe, and we see that, well, our eyes are closed, so we're dealing with frontal eye field area. We also go to an area, we follow this line here, and we see that it's right in this area where that parietal and temporal lobe meet, and this is going to be primary gustatory. So gustatory is taste. And then we'll save our motor areas for our motor slides. So let's look at our, just quickly, just identify them. Again, central sulcus is our landmark. Anterior to it, we have our primary motor area, our precentral gyrus. Okay, and then we go to the front portion of that, to that frontal lobe, and we have our premotor area. So to repeat our motor areas of the cerebral cortex, we're pretty much staying in that precentral sulcus region, so our precentral gyrus. So hit that central sulcus in the center again. Everything anterior to it is going to be our premotor area. So primary motor area is our precentral gyrus, and then the premotor area is everything in orange in front of it. And that deals with moving eyes, so a frontal eye field area, so moving your eyes to see. So the first slide went through sensory, the second one was motor, and the last one is going to be association. Where are we associating this information? So again, right here on the parietal lobe, we have our somatosensory association. We're going to have in our occipital lobe our visual association area. And then we can go to our auditory, primary auditory area over here. So again, there are three aspects: motor, sensory, and association of the cerebral cortex. Hemispheric lateralization, which is also known as hemispheric specialization, basically refers to the different and specific functions performed by the two hemispheres of the brain. So Table 14.3 goes through some examples. Now we can look at it pretty simply and say an example of this would be language skills are primarily located in the left hemisphere, while spatial reasoning and mechanical skills are associated with the right. So again, look at our table. Our left hemisphere receives somatic sensory signals from and controls muscles on the right side of the body. We see it deals with reasoning, numeric and scientific skills, ability to use and understand sign language, spoken and written language, and persons with damage in this left hemisphere often exhibit aphasia. Now, aphasia is the loss of ability to understand or express speech, and again, typically caused by brain damage. Now, on the right hemisphere of the brain, we're dealing with receiving somatic sensory signals from and controls muscles on left side of the body. Now, musical and artistic awareness is exhibited here, space and pattern perception, recognition of faces and emotional content of facial expressions, generating emotional content of language, generating mental images to compare spatial relationships, identifying and discriminating among odors, and then we talk about damage. So patients with damages in the right hemisphere regions that correspond to Broca's and Wernicke's area. So again, look, we're talking about Broca's and Wernicke's area. In the left hemisphere, speak in a monotonous voice, having lost the ability to impart emotional inflection to what they say. The next structures that we're going to look at are the cranial nerves of the brain. Now, there are 12 cranial nerves that we're going to look at. 1 through 12 are named. You can use your book or the internet to come up with the mnemonic to help you find it and identify and outline those names. You are responsible for knowing the cranial nerve, the components, meaning is it sensory, motor, or both. So this is almost like a functional aspect. And you're going to be responsible for knowing the principal function of each cranial nerves. For example, cranial nerve number 1 is a sensory function, and its principal action is olfaction. Okay. Now, the book uses a mnemonic saying, "On old Olympus towering top, a friendly Viking grew vines and hops," to outline the 12 cranial nerves. Again, there's close to, 1 million cranial nerves found on the internet. We're going to go through them, but you can find which one works for you. Now, there is a mnemonic for the components or this function, and it goes, "Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more." So again, we can write this out, and I'll show you on the next slide how we can write this out pretty straightforward and pretty easily to make it a little easier for you to integrate into your brain to understand when you're studying. So let's start with cranial nerve number 1. It is the olfactory nerve. It serves a sensory function for smell. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. Again, a sensory function for sight or vision. The third cranial nerve is called the oculomotor. And again, think about the words oculo, eye, motor, movement. This is a motor function, so motor component, meaning that it's dealing with movement of the eyeballs and the upper eyelid. The trochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 4, is another motor nerve. Again, this is also going to help with movement of the eyeball. One of the largest nerves in your face is cranial nerve number 5. This is called the trigeminal nerve. Now, this is where we're going to see something called mixed. Now, my mnemonic, I use the word both. So when you talk about mixed, you can write in both because it works a little bit better with my mnemonic. The next cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 6. This is the abducens. It is a motor nerve, which is controlling movement of the eyeballs. Cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve. This is, again, a mixed or both. It serves a sensory function for taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, touch, pain, and thermal sensations from skin in the external ear canal. Its motor aspect is controlling muscles of facial expressions and the middle ear muscles, as well as secreting tears and saliva. Now, the vestibular cochlear nerve. This is an interesting nerve because we have two portions, a vestibular branch and a cochlear branch. This is cranial nerve number 8. It is a sensory function. Now, I want to make point of one thing. Notice our trigeminal, we see just sensory, and then olfactory and sight, we see special sensory. This is part of our special senses. When we do our special senses lab in AP2, this will make a little more sense. You could just call it sensory for now, just to keep it a little bit easier for us. Now back to our vestibular cochlear nerve. Depending on the branch, the cochlear branch is for hearing, so we'll put a C here, and the equilibrium branch is the vestibular branch, so we'll put a V there. Now we continue with cranial nerve number 9. This is our glossopharyngeal nerve. This is, again, both mixed, so it has sensory and motor. The sensory portion is taste from the back 1/3 of the tongue, and balance or proprioception and some swallowing muscles. It also aids to monitor blood pressure and oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood, dealing with touch, pain, and thermal sensations from skin of the external ear and upper pharynx. Its motor aspect, we look at the brachial branch, deals with assisting in swallowing, and for the autonomic portion, for rest and digest, we're talking about secretion of saliva. Now, the most important cranial nerve in the body is cranial nerve number 10. This is the vagus nerve. Again, pretty much touches everything. It is action is both mixed sensory and motor. It's sensory, taste from the epiglottis. Yes, our epiglottis has taste buds on it. Proprioception from throat and voice box muscles. It monitors blood pressure and oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. Deals with touch, pain, and thermal sensation from skin of the external ear. Sensation from thorax and abdominal organs. Now, its motor aspect, swallowing, vocalization, and coughing. Motility and secretion of gastrointestinal organs, so we're dealing with digestion. Constriction of respiratory passageways for breathing. And then decreasing heart rate for cardiovascular. So you can see this vagus nerve has its hand in multiple systems, the digestive, the respiratory, and the cardiovascular. Cranial nerve number 11 is a motor nerve. It's called the accessory nerve. It deals with movement of the head and the pectoral girdle, so our shoulder. The hypoglossal nerve, the last one, is cranial nerve number 12. It is a motor nerve. It deals with speech, manipulation of food, and deglutition, which is also known as swallowing. So what we're going to do now is kind of cover this table so I can draw out the easier way for you to align all this and to memorize. This also help you in lab. So we start with our mnemonic. On old Olympus towering top, a friendly Viking grew vines and hops. Now you can see below our book uses OOO to touch and feel very green vegetables. It's a little odd. Again, you could come up with your own or Google it. Again, go to our function. We deal with some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. Now what we can do is easily box out certain cranial nerves once we have the names, right? So if we look at the oculomotor, we box it out, cranial nerve number 3. We know its name, oculomotor, and we know its action, meaning it is a motor nerve. Let's go to our facial nerve. We can box it out and say this is cranial nerve number 7. It serves both a motor and sensory function. So again, a nice little way to organize your studies to make it a little easier to learn, especially come exam time. The next slide shows us our cranial nerve. It is an animation for our nervous system, an overview of our nervous systems, focusing on the cranial nerve. Remember, in order to access this animation, you need to be connected to the internet and in slideshow mode in our regular slides. You cannot do this from this tutorial. You need to be in your slide sorter view on your downloaded slides. So the next few slides are going to be review of our cranial nerves with a little more detail, kind of putting it all together for you. So we start again with cranial nerve number 1. It's our olfactory nerve. These nerves carry olfactory stimuli, again, smell from the nasal mucosa. Presynaptic neurons pass through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone and enter the olfactory bulb. Postsynaptic neurons will proceed to the cerebrum. Its function, it's a sensory function, and sensing smell. Injury, if you damage this nerve, you lose the sense of smell. This is known as anosmia. Our picture of this nerve, we see the cribriform plate. We can zoom on in and see the cribriform plate right here. That nasal mucosa, this is where all this mucus will be sitting in here. And in special senses, we'll focus on this in a lot more detail. The olfactory bulb here, when we do our brain dissection in lab, that's what we'll be identifying, the olfactory bulb with the olfactory tract. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve, again carrying visual input from the eyes and passes through the optic canal of the sphenoid bone. They converge and decussate or cross at the optic chiasm. Neurons synapse in the thalamus with fibers extending to the occipital lobe. Some axons synapse at the superior colliculi. If you remember our corpora quadrigemina, those twins, so we have some axons are going to synapse there. Their function is a sensory function, and they serve a sense for sight. Damage to this nerve causes vision loss. Again, let's put it to picture. We have the retina. This is our photoreceptive layer of the eyeball. The optic nerve here, and where it crosses here at the optic chiasm. The third cranial nerve is oculomotor. Innervates 4 out of our 6 muscles that control eye movement. It emerges at the midbrain and penetrates the posterior orbit of the eye. Its function is a motor function, strictly for eye movement. If you injure this nerve, you have pain over the eye, possible double vision due to the inability to coordinate movements of the eyes. It also innervates the ciliary ganglia, therefore it's going to control pupil diameter. Let's take a picture or take a look at this nerve. We see cranial nerve number 3, that's that oculomotor nerve, going to 4 of our 6 muscles, and again, its origination. Cranial nerve number 4 is the trochlear nerve. It originates in the midbrain, innervates the superior oblique muscles of the eye, and controls eye movement again. Its function is motor, again eye movement. If you injure this nerve, you have problems looking down and to the side. We can put it to picture, and right below that oculomotor, we have our trochlear nerve. Again, you see that if you follow that nerve, it innervates the superior oblique muscle. That brings us to cranial nerve number 5, again the largest nerve in the face. It has many afferent sensory fibers. Look at its origins: the eyes, nasal cavity, skin of forehead, eyelid, eyebrows, lips, gums, teeth, cheeks, pharynx, palate, tongue. There's an ophthalmic maxillary mandibular branch that extend to nuclei in the pons. There's a mandibular branch, also innervates muscles for chewing, which is also known as mastication. The function is both sensory and motor. Injury is called trigeminal neuralgia. This is a very painful condition induced by contact with the lips, tongue, or gums. To put it into a clinical perspective, most of you have had this nerve numbed. If you've ever had a cavity or a tooth extracted, they give you something called the mandibular block. So they go into one of the largest ganglia in the back of the mouth. There's a trigeminal ganglia. And if you look at what this nerve touches, gums, lips, teeth, cheek, eyebrows, eyelid, tongue, palate, pharynx. If you've ever had that big needle that goes way, way back into your mouth and it hurts a lot, but your face is numb for 6 to 8 hours, you can't talk, chew, nothing for 6 to 8 hours, that's a trigeminal block. This is the nerve that they are accessing and numbing. Here's a picture of our trigeminal nerve, and look, follow all these branches, right? We go to the face, the eyelids, the forehead. We go to the teeth, the gums, the nasal cavity, the lips. We go to the muscles of mastication, the masseter muscle right here for chewing, and the tongue. Follow this branch down here to the tongues and the muscles for swallowing. So again, our trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens nerve. It originates in the pons and passes through the superior orbital fissure in the sphenoid bone. If you go back to our skeletal lab where we went through the skull and we found these orbital fissures, superior and inferior orbital fissure, if we looked into the face, into the eyes, we saw those X's. That would be where this nerve passes. Contraction to the lateral rectus muscle allows the eye to remain positioned within the orbit. Its function again is motor. If you injure this nerve, your eyeballs turn inward like being cross-eyed. Following our eye nerves, we have our oculomotor on top, trochlear next, and the one we just discussed, the abducens nerves, and there it goes, innervating the lateral rectus. Our seventh nerve is the facial nerve. Its origin is the sensory and motor fibers emerge from the pons and the branch into the temporal, zygomatic, mandibular, buccal, and cervical branches. Fibers innervate the sublingual, submandibular, and lacrimal glands. Its function is both sensory and motor. If you have injury, you suffer from something called Bell's palsy, which gives you drooping of the eye and corner of the mouth. And this, again, is typically due to viral infections. We can look at a picture of the facial nerve. We follow that geniculate ganglia right here. Follow the nerves, look where it's going, into the muscles of the neck, the face, the tongue, the palate, the pharynx, following these branches, etc. Cranial nerve number 8, our double branch nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve. It originates, its origin monitors the receptors of the inner ear. The vestibular branch is for balance and equilibrium. The cochlear branch is for actual hearing. Axons leaving the brainstem relay sensory information to other centers that are concerned with reflexive motor responses. Its function is sensory, specifically special senses. Injury to the cochlear branch gives us true deafness, loss of hearing, and injury to the vestibular branch gives us vertigo or dizziness. We could take a look at that nerve and look at that branch right here. Branching to the vestibule for balance or the cochlea for hearing. Cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal. Remember, glosso, tongue, pharyngeal, pharynx. Its origin is the medulla oblongata. Sensory fibers innervate the posterior 1/3 part of the tongue, part of the pharynx, palate, and carotid arteries. Those carotid bodies are there to monitor blood pressure and blood gas level. Motor fibers innervate the pharyngeal muscles. These are throat muscles for swallowing food. Function, both sensory and motor. Now, if we injure this nerve, we get loss of a gag reflex and sensation to the throat area, which leads to ultimately a problem with swallowing. We take a look at a picture of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So again, we go to the pharynx and the tongue. So we go to this portion of the tube that regulates swallowing. The most important cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. Origin, the medulla oblongata. Sensory fibers from the visceral organs of the thorax and abdominal pelvic cavities, the external air, diaphragm, and pharynx. Motor fibers to the visceral organs in the thorax and abdominal pelvic cavity. 75% output for parasympathetic nervous system. This is rest and digest. Function, both sensory and motor. Now, if you injure the vagus nerve, you have difficulty swallowing, you get an impairment of voice, and visceral disturbances. Another way where we see people subconsciously trying to relax themselves. If you ever see anybody who's really, really stressed and nervous and they start massaging and rubbing the sides of their neck, what they're doing is trying to activate the vagus nerve by heating it up, stimulating action potentials, which increases that or activates the parasympathetic nervous system for resting and digesting, giving an overall calming effect. Take a look at this big nerve. It goes pretty much everywhere. It goes to the gallbladder, the liver, the lungs, the larynx, the carotid bodies in the heart, the actual heart, stomach for digestion, small intestine, large intestine, etc. So it goes everywhere viscerally. Cranial nerve number 11, the accessory nerve. Origin is the nuclei of the medulla oblongata. It touches the muscles of the larynx, the sternocleidomastoid, and the trapezius. Its function is motor for muscles, for the muscles above that we just outlined. Injury. If you injured this nerve, you have difficulty rotating your head and raising your shoulders. So we follow this nerve, and there it goes, right to the trapezius muscle. and our sternocleidomastoid right there. Cranial nerve number 12 is our hypoglossal nerve, hypo below, glossus tongue. Its origin, nuclei of the medulla oblongata, innervates the muscles of the tongue, the front 2/3. Remember our previous nerve hit the back third. Its function is motor. Injury, we have problems with speech, chewing, and swallowing, mastication and deglutition. If the nerve is damaged, a person cannot stick their tongue out straight. So give this a try. If you cannot stick your tongue out perfectly straight, you may have damage to your hypoglossal nerve. It's a fun little test. And we can see this nerve going right there to the genioglossus, muscles for the tongue, as well as our tongue. So that concludes our lecture on the brain and cranial nerves. Again, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or concerns.